Hello and welcome to Museum Berggruen in Berlin. I'm Gabriel Montua, head of the museum, and I will take you on a tour. The museum owes its name and its collection to Heinz Berggruen, Berlin-born art dealer who established himself in Paris after World War II, who became acquainted with many artists he was selling in his gallery. Paul Klee, Henri Matisse, Alberto Giacometti, Paul Cézanne, Henri Laurence, Alexander Calder. Most notably Pablo Picasso, with whom he signed an exclusive contract to sell some of his printed works. And that's why he established a collection where you'll find many works by Picasso. Having said this, we would like to introduce you to the first room, which shows the works from his very early age. What you see in the middle of the room are the masterworks from the Rose and Blue period, first specific works where Picasso developed an own style. The first work you will also see in this room was made in 1897 when he was just 16 years old. And our most recent work dates from 1972, just 1 year before he died at age 92. So the particularity of Museum Berggruen is that you can witness the evolution of a style across 9 decades. Only the specialized Picasso museums have the possibility to present his work in such depth. Speaking here about the early 1900s, for example, in this drawing you see a style that you could describe as almost caricature-like. Picasso arriving on his first trip to Paris, 1901. The artist wearing the red coat and having a folder with his drawings and works under his arm, and in the background the Eiffel Tower. You see to the right is the Blue period with a scene of café concert with 2 rather sad people sitting at the table without speaking to each other, and in the background dancers. In the middle, the red painting is a seated harlequin taken from circus life. And on the right-hand side, you see the portrait of Jaime Sabatés, poet and friend of Picasso, who later became a secretary. You see to the right. The caricature-like style is particularly visible in a small work, resembles that people did when they were having long conversations on the landline phones, making lots of different drawings on the same sheet that have no coherence as an ensemble, but show a lot of different character studies. And you will see some exaggeration of faces. You will note the long moustaches of the man or the animal heads. In these early years, we can see both the drawings and very humorous style and close to, yes, caricature or even cartoon, and the rather sad or melancholic works from the Blue period or the Rose period. A lot of visitors told me how much they liked the intimacy of these rooms and the special character. And I'm sure you will agree that this is a little bit different from just a normal museum, which is either very clean and white cubish or very sumptuous with columns. This is something very special. It reflects the apartment of a private person from the size of its walls. So one could add that Heinz Berggruen and his wife Bettina used to actually live in this museum on the second floor, where their apartment was adjacent to the galleries. And Heinz Berggruen really enjoyed coming out of his apartment and mingle with visitors, engaging them in conversation about the artists that were shown there. So this just underlines this private and intimate atmosphere of this museum. Well, the first room showed the works from 1897 to 1905. This room is dedicated entirely to the year 1906. This is a very important year in the development of Picasso's style, as he left behind, or he was about to leave behind, the Rose period, and the subjects of his portraiture changed drastically. It was a very archaic look, inspired by early Iberian sculptures, prehistoric, pre-Roman sculptures from Spain, but also woodcuts from Oceania. You will notice the austere look of the faces, the rather large eyes, which are stylistic characteristics taken from these inspiration. Here we see the chronologically first sculpture by Picasso in our collection, a girl combing her hair. And as you will also notice later on in different rooms, Picasso's style in painting or drawing and sculpture often corresponds, meaning he uses the same stylistic devices, formalist devices, both in sculpture and painting and drawing. The story behind this collection is that in the 1990s, the Stülerbau, as we call it, the building itself, became free. And Heinz Berggruen, who was at that time with his collection at the National Gallery in London, was invited by the museums to show his collection in his native city. Heinz Berggruen had to flee the country in 1936. He came back with one of the most fascinating collection of modern art in the 20th century to the reunified Berlin. It was something much talked about at the time. This more Parisian modernism was something that was strongly missing in Berlin's collection at the time. What had been there bought at the time of its emergence had been purged during the 1930s and the hunting of degenerated art. And even though a few important works, Picasso, for example, could be acquired for West Berlin, nothing to compare in both terms of quantity or quality with what Heinz Berggruen brought. A whole room devoted to the year 1906, a game changer in his later development, as we will see in the next room, which is devoted to the following years. So the next room is very important as it will make more evident the later development of Cubism. For Picasso, Cubism had two major sources of inspiration. One is portraiture and follows what we've seen in the room just before, 1906, and the encounter of more archaic facial features. These became even more radical after Picasso visited the ethnological collection at the Musée du Trocadéro in Paris and saw African masks and objects. This further radicalized facial features and the portraiture of his works and will lead to one of the most famous paintings by Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, that are now at the MoMA in New York. These are studies for the Demoiselle. This portrait of a woman in reds, you will recognize the round, big eyes that we saw from 1906 of early Iberian origin. In the next, with this yellow mask, the influence of African masks are very visible. This is also probably the work which is most easily recognizable in the Demoiselles d'Avignon. It's the woman standing at the back at the right. The other inspiration that was very important at these times was Cézanne. That's why we presented on the opposite wall two works that are heavily indebted by Cézanne and his legacy. Cézanne was famous for his landscapes, which he broke up into similar patterns. Here you can see a depiction of Horta de Ebro, a small town in Spain. The only difference maybe between Cézanne and Picasso is that Picasso here already deliberately destroyed the central perspective. You see, from each house, when you look at it, is rendered as if we're looking at it from a different standpoint as a viewer. So this is something that Cézanne did not go as far, and it will be very important to keep that in mind when we leave the ground floor of Museum Berggruen and move up to the first floor, where we will see where these two developments lead to. So I repeat, one are the destruction of the central perspective and the geometrization of objects in nature. The other one are portraiture and a radicalization of facial features of the subject. On the right-hand side, the small work is a still life with apple and pears, a motif that Cézanne absolutely loved and produced over and over again, and which Picasso also copied. Picasso knew the famous quote by Cézanne, which said that nature should be rendered in geometrical forms as the sphere and the cone. In these objects, in these apple and pears, you see exactly what Cézanne meant and what Picasso also took over. What you see when you walk into the museum is works that belong to the German state and some works that are generously on permanent loan owned by the members of the Berggruen family. The city of Berlin, the institution, was so fascinated with it that it purchased the collection from Heinz Berggruen in the year 2000 in, one of the most important single acquisitions in the history of the State Museums Berlin and Nationalgalerie. The collection continued to be presented there until Heinz Berggruen passed away in 2007, after which the members of his family decided to keep on supporting the museum by having permanent loans of works belonging to them, and we're very grateful for this prolonged and continuous support to our museum. Speaking about portraiture, this sailor rolling a cigarette is also a study for Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, but at an earlier stage, and as you're familiar with the work at MoMA, it's the male subjects of the painting, sailor and the student, have been left out by Picasso in the final version. And now we are on the first floor of Museum Berggruen, which will present Picasso's further works as a full circle of 8 rooms, an enfilade of 4 large and 4 smaller rooms. This room is the Cubist room, the first Cubist room, and as you remember from what we just seen downstairs, there were 2 major issues for Picasso. One was the radicalization of portraiture, and the second, abolition of the central perspective and the geometrization of nature and objects. These 2 combined lead to what Picasso and Georges Braque developed, became known as Cubism, meaning that objects are broken up into different elements of geometrical nature. A lot of right angles, curves, intertwined in such a way that it's impossible to say which one lies on top of the other, meaning that there is no central perspective. This applies both to still lifes, like guitars and violins, very subject that they especially liked, but also to portraiture and even to sculpture. So this bust by Fernand Olivier, Picasso's partner at the time, is amazing as it shows this 3-dimensional approach, which Cubism is all about, also as a sculpture. And here you see that there is no real difference in the treatment of the face compared to the rest of her head. Her hair growing tall on the skull cap and the hair at the back. So everything in the sculpture has the same importance as does Cubism, where no single object of, let's say, a still life is more important than the others, as they are all broken up into the same elements and scattered across the surface. So portraiture, yes, especially at the beginning, a rather important part of Cubism. This one is a presumed portrait of Georges Braque, with whom Picasso worked and exchanged daily during Cubism time, and their works were so similar at some point that they made jokes of not signing them so that people would be confused who it was. Picasso never admitted that it was Braque, but he never denied it, and we know that Braque was very fond of those bowler hats and smoked the pipe. That's why this portrait became known as a portrait of Georges Braque. Here a large Cubist still life, also leading already to the second phase. The first one is called the analytical Cubism because of this breaking down of objects into their small elements. That's why analytic in the sense of analyzing the structure of the object. Whereas the second phase, which starts, yes, around 1912, is called the synthetical Cubism, meaning a synthesis of different materials. So this is where the collage, for example, in this painting, we see sand, for example, another material that Picasso and Braque really enjoyed, but they were also using other, popular or worthless materials as newspapers or pieces of wood. It's also important to remember the playfulness of Cubism. So here, for example, you see wood, which is painted. Braque, who painted this, was also trained as a decorative painter, so he knew all about the skills and tricks of painting. And the playfulness here is not to put in a real piece of wood, but to paint a piece of wood that looks real. And also the paper, the newspaper, which you see in the middle, Le Quotidien du Midi, you just see the letters Q and U, and D and U are painted. So the pasted elements both are on the same level of importance in a Cubist painting of the synthetical period. In this second Cubist room, we see works from the later phase of Cubism, mostly the synthetical phase, and the play of collage elements, even more visible here than in the first room. Here again, a still life with painted wood and cards and bottles and sand, a motif that repeats itself a lot of times in Cubism in very different constellations. Also, as you remember from the first room, letters that don't really make sense, A, V, and I. Certainly Avignon, where this painting was made, but you don't realize at first glance without further knowledge. Another portrait, very small and hardly to be made out, the man who's portraited in here. And now we come to the presentation of glasses. Glasses and bottles, as I said, very important subject matters in Cubist still life. This object is the absent glass, which Picasso casted in bronze in 6 different editions, which he all hand-painted differently. He also put on top of it a real absinthe spoon. The practice of this drink before it was banned because of its intoxicating substances was to take sugar and pour the absinthe over the sugar. That's why the spoon has little holes in it. Then light it with a match and drown the burning spoon in the absinthe. That's why you see the absinthe spoon is a real spoon that he bought, but the sugar cube is part of the sculpture again. It's more a negative sculpture, as the glass itself is cast as a blank and wraps the glass, which you can see wraps around this void in the middle. This small piece is the only one in our collection where Picasso actually uses real newspaper. The others are painted, and you see a newspaper and another glass. That's why they are positioned to the left and right of the glass sculpture. But also other cheap or common elements can be found in Picasso's Cubist paintings. Like here, the grapes in the still life are made from sawdust. It's also important to remember is the friendship of Picasso and his circle. So in here you see the paper card that is included in this still life is actually an announcement of a book by a friend Max Jacob, inviting people to buy this book. So even if Max Jacob missed out on selling one book because Picasso used the card in his painting, he's probably happy in the end to have it in one of Picasso's finest Cubist still lifes. So with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the cooperation between Picasso and Braque found a sudden end because Braque was drafted to the front and had to stop painting. And during the war, where Picasso, a Spanish subject, did not have to take arms, he also developed another direction. He met Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe and traveled with this ensemble to Italy, where he met his first wife, Olga, who was a ballet dancer, and also saw Italian antiquity in Rome and Pompeii and Naples. This led to something which the poet Jean Cocteau later described as the return to order, meaning that after the Cubist experiments, suddenly Picasso also started to paint very figuratively again. And this is something that will be determining also the rest of his career. It's not as clear-cut as this. It's not that Picasso one day just stops making Cubist paintings, now turns to classical painting, but both are done at exactly the same time. In some pieces, like this still life in front of an open window in San Rafael, you see that they even coexist within the same surface, the same pictorial space. So while the background seems absolutely realistic, little beautiful white clouds over a horizon, an open window looking out at the sea, a very famous subject matter that, for example, Matisse used regularly. But in front of it, you see a table with a Cubist still life on it. In fact, the shock of the Cubist still life is even bigger when cast against such a realistic background. It is important to be aware of this coexistence of these two styles, because in his later career, Picasso will use any style he likes. And since he was technically able to master all the styles, he could choose or pick whatever style he wanted to for his representations. In the development, I mean, we're now here in the 1920s. If we consider Picasso's early works as a teenager already in the last decade of the 19th century, we have here 30 years of work by Picasso to reach a point from which on he could now do whatever he wanted. Here, another very fine example of this so-called return to order, a nude drying her feet. The subject matter is classical. It's taking up the position of the spinario. In antiquity, usually a boy taking out a thorn from his foot. And you also see the drape, very classical. But one should beware and look at the details to see that Picasso did not plainly just return to classicism. There are some strange elements. You will see that the extremities, the hand and the feet, are way too large. And if you look behind the seated woman, the horizon line is not the same on the left and on the right, which is something you would not find in a real classical painting. Here again, even if there is a return to order, a return to classicism, there is always some playfulness and some twist to make it not just a copy of 19th century academic painting, which all the avant-garde movements tried to leave behind. Yeah, the next room is dedicated to Picasso in the early 1930s. And there are two elements of subject matter that are now important for him. One is a stylistic flirt with surrealism, where you see the still life in the studio with an impossible structure. Also, these basers, the swimmers in the sea, are wildly configured. And the other important recurring feature is an interest in antiquity. Interest in antiquity is especially visible in this Silenus and Dancing Company, where you see a jolly group of antique-looking men and women, which are strangely rather ghostly and white, returning from some probably rather exuberant feast. It also recalls not only antiquity, but also, yes, Renaissance and the reception of antiquity, and this one particularly so to Nicolas Poussin, who Picasso greatly admired and studied at the Louvre. The work right next to it is called The Sculptor and His Statue, and is also a recurring theme more or less throughout Picasso's career, the action that happens in the studio between a painter or a sculptor and his model. Fawn's head, that's another creature derived from antiquity. Women playing the tambourine, which also seems to emanate from a festivity. So here already the rendering of it is very, very reduced on a black surface. So this room is dedicated to the late 1930s and shows a lot of portraiture. Central wall just in front of us, one of the most famous pieces from my collection, the Yellow Sweater, painted in 1939, showing Dora Maar, his partner at that time. And you will recognize in the face very strong splitting, which is, of course, a consequence of Cubism. also reflects a lot of other preoccupations as well. The outbreak of the Spanish Civil War first in Spain, which deeply affected Picasso, and the danger of the World War II, which officially broke out in September 1939. And this painting was done at the end of October. But the split face, of course, is something that happened already earlier in Picasso's career. It looks like he had disassembled the face and put it back together like puzzle pieces that do not really match. And there are two different ways of doing it. This one is much more edgy and much more brutal, so to speak, than the Yellow Sweater, which looks like almost a polished finish, as if we had some polished marble face, some very noble material. But the brutality behind this face splitting is the same in both finishes, polished or edgy. Here it's not as visible, but still the face and especially the nose are dispersed and reassembled with the play of light and shade underneath the hat of the sailor, and with a color palette that is extremely bright and gives a pre-pop art look to the sailor. In this etching, it's called the Minotauromachie, so the creation derived from tauromachy, which means bullfight in Spanish, and using Minotauromachy. The Minotaur was in antiquity a creature that has the head of a bull, but the body of a human. And it was a monster that had to be hidden away in the labyrinth of King Minos on the island of Crete. That's why it was called a Minotaurus. So it's a fantastic creature which is half animal, half human, and was very important in Picasso's work, especially in the mid-1930s. He depicted this creature over and over again, sometimes here in a rather aggressive style. Coming in from the right, holding a dagger. In front of him is a woman that looks either conscienceless or even dead on the back of a horse. And this parade is being stopped by a little girl holding a candle and a bunch of flowers, whereas some bystanders, a man half naked climbing up a ladder as if hiding away from the scene, and two women watching it from a balcony. Mysterious scene, but we see that this, attacking monster more or less is being checked and held in check by this little girl. We have a Minotaurus also being sometimes wounded or even dying. Sometimes he's kissing sleeping women. So we see him in a lot of very different situations. It would be a bit far to say it's an alter ego of Picasso, but he surely thought a lot about this creature. And in this particular one, it's recognized by most experts as one of his finest etching. And it's very interesting because he never sold it. He only gave it away to France. That's why we don't even know the exact number of it. We believe there are about 50 copies of it, and it were only used as presents. And this one is particularly interesting to note at bottom left, the dedication to Mon Ami Berggruen, with a signature of Picasso. He misspelled the name of Heinz Berggruen, which he always did, maybe even on purpose, we don't know. But it definitely shows the close connection between Picasso and his art dealer, Heinz Berggruen, who managed to have an exclusive contract for selling some of his graphic printed works. This is also very important to keep in mind in the whole collection of Heinz Berggruen, that the close personal tie to the artist, in this case Picasso, and there exists a lot of photographs where you see the two of them together. This is another version of a portrait of Dora Maar called With the Green Fingernails. Also very interesting composition. She's leaning towards the left. It's extremely large eyes and the green fingernails from the title. It was a present to Dora Maar, and she kept this above her fireplace until her death in 1997, after which Heinz Berggruen could buy it at the auction of her estate. Important fact to remember that Heinz Berggruen was one of the few gallerists who also considered Dora Maar as an artist, something which is now being rediscovered. During the 20th century, she was more or less reduced to the sole role of a muse or partner of Picasso, and is becoming more and more recognized also for her artistic work, both as a photographer and as a painter. And Heinz Berggruen was one of the few gallerists who already in the 1950s gave her an exhibition at his gallery. So he was also, for Dora Maar, who lived very secluded and did not have a lot of social context in her later life, there was also a personal tie between Heinz Berggruen and Dora Maar. Another gift from Picasso was this delicate and fragile small blackbird, which opens another aspect of Picasso's way of work. We've seen already in the Cubist collage the inclusion of everyday materials. Here it is also very visible. It's just a very thin wood, as from a cigar box, pasted together with a bit of plaster, and everything holded up just on a piece of wire, which, if it were not under a glass case, would be moving slightly in the air as a blackbird flying. At the time, 1943, so it was also the time when Picasso and Dora Maar broke up, so kind of a symbolic farewell present. A large-size portrait of a rooster. It's always one of the favorites of school classes and kids when they come to the museum. This is a room of the 1940s during Second World War. Another favorite motif of Picasso and recurring: women awake watching a man sleep. And this was actually the first Picasso work acquired by Heinz Berggruen, and dates from 1942. Similar subject matter with two women. And here we introduce also another aspect of Picasso's work, which he discovered in the late 1940s, which is pottery. As Picasso left Paris more and more for the south of France, he discovered also the pottery at Vallauris, where he spent a lot of time doing plates and jugs. Here this plate shows the real tauromachy, a bullfight, a very Spanish scene. Also maybe he used to compensate his nostalgia or longing for his native Spain, which he could not enter after Franco's victory in the Spanish War. And since Franco survived Picasso by 2 years, he never set foot again to Spain. So it's a very small and delicate works. This Seated Woman in particular is very interesting. A series of several works that are in Musée Picasso in Paris. It also shows how Picasso moves back and forth in style, taken up elements of Cubism in the construction of the figure, Cubist elements and the surreal settings of the 1930s. Also is something in between a two-dimensional and three-dimensional work, is a work in relief and painted on, and this is something one can see from the side. The whole thing is based on a cigarette box, shows both the working with everyday objects, maybe also the restrictions of material during World War II, where Picasso, who is one of the rare artists who were declared opponents of fascism and labeled degenerated artist by the Nazis, still stayed in Paris, unlike many others who emigrated, where he was not harmed but was not allowed to exhibit, and very difficult conditions for an artist. This is a very fine sketch with a clear line showing the studio of Dora Maar. By this also an acknowledgement of her artistic activity. The two persons that we see are not Dora, but Paul Éluard taking a sip from a cup, and Jean Cocteau drawing in Dora Maar's studio. A bit strange that Dora Maar is not present in her own in her own space. In this room, on the largest wall, you see a large work by Picasso, which is not ours. It belongs to the collection of Neue Nationalgalerie, and we swapped it in this occasion against one of our masterpieces, a great reclining nude from 1942, which also thematically fits to the war years, which we just described, but which was used in the reopening exhibition of Neue Nationalgalerie. That's why the other pieces of this room are devoted to the 1950s. You see version L of Picasso's series, The Women of Algiers, which was the first great series that he did after Old Masters, so in a way the beginning of his late works, with 3 series on Old Masters, first on Delacroix's Women of Algiers, then on Velázquez Las Meninas, and on Manet Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Here it's a monumental rendering of just one of these seated women in Algiers, and you will make out to the left a hookah, a water pipe that she is holding in her hands. Her legs are crossed while she's sitting on the floor with some pointed shoes and some kind of hat or some cover for her head from which a veil falls. She has no face, just a round shape indicating more or less where the face would be. And one barely makes out a little bit of tiling to the left, which of course in Delacroix's realistic painting are very finely executed Arabic ornamental tiles. This version is a rather cubist version of the series. As I said, there are 15 altogether, and all change in style. So towards the end of the series, suddenly color disappears from one painting to the other, and he turns to this grisaille, which was also typical of the first phase of Cubism, the analytical Cubism, where Picasso and Braque wanted to get rid of color so that it would not distract attention from the mere and the pure form. This small work by Henri Laurens, also known as the sculptor of Cubism, also belonged to a Neue Nationalgalerie, but it just fits so perfectly together with Picasso's painting. Somebody who is not as recognized as Picasso or Braque are, more or less self-taught, and who made a career as a sculptor. We do have a work of Laurens in our collection at Museum Berggruen, that's why we thought it good to include it. And this dates from the 1920s, so it's about 30 years earlier than Picasso's work, but when you see them side by side, it looks as if Picasso's Women of Algiers version L has been a portrait of this sculpture by Henri Laurens. Crane is by Picasso again and shows very well what we've seen already before, the inclusion of everyday materials. So here he used forks for the legs, the blade of a spade for the tail, and a little tap for the crest on top of the bird's head. All these materials he assembled and then had them cast in bronze to paint them. When you see from up front, you see the whole construction is a little bit shaky. So even though it's bronze and a solid compound, the whole construction still shows the tentativeness and the ephemerality of everyday objects assembled. And lastly in this room, a large painting called La Lecture, the reading, where you see women with a mildly split face, reminiscent of the late 30s and the yellow sweater that we've seen, reading a book. The whole looks a little bit reptilia-like through the interesting formation on her back, but one sees it's clearly an indoor scene next to a red wallpaper with dotted patterns. This is the final room of our Picasso presentation, where we see two examples of sculptures from the 1960s, and then also works from the very end of his career. So this is while Picasso was aging, as I mentioned already earlier, with a series inspired by old masters, he was turning more and more towards art history, and as if he wanted to paint himself into art history. So a lot of inspiration from old masters, which are not always as clearly labeled as with Delacroix and the Women of Algiers. Here we see the large hat of this man is reminiscent of 17th century Dutch masters, Rembrandt, somebody he admired a lot, and of course the Spanish painters, Velázquez or Zurbarán. So the title says a matador, so somebody from the bullfight, and next to it a female nude. This female nude is the very latest work from our collection, so it dates from the summer of 1972, where Picasso did not even have one more year to live. So what I said in the beginning, that at Museum Berggruen you can really walk through 9 decades. We saw the first piece, the little paper where he drew faces and animals from 1897. Here you see the latest work also on paper from 1972. Yeah, very simple forms of sculptures of a woman with a raised arm, or next to it a musician that more or less plays the trumpet. And some colorful representations of circus, something which was very important for him in the Rose period. At the beginning, remember the seated harlequin that we saw. This is why it's so good to have so many works by Picasso assembled in one house, that visitors will remember, for example, the seated harlequin that we saw, and see that even here, while he was really at the end of his life, 60 years later, he would still work on the same subject matter. Again, something from the circus, which he and his friends enjoyed in their early youth. It always goes back and forth on Picasso, and as you will have noticed that some elements always come back. Here again, the artist and his model, and the representation of Eve coming out of Adam's rib, and also a split face again. Here the motifs of basers, swimmers, which we also saw in this 1934 surrealist piece, now from 1961. This is a portrait of Jacqueline, Picasso's second and last wife, Jacqueline Rogge, who spent the last 20 years by the side of Picasso. throws back to the early work we saw in the 1906 rooms with the large eyes, but also is influenced by Spanish tradition, portraiture of the Baroque, Siglo de Oro, 17th century paintings. So visitors will, as they walk through, and as I hope you who have joined us on this tour will also appreciate, will always be guided back and forth inside Picasso's oeuvre. This is what I think makes it so wonderful to be able to present so many different works from so many different periods from Picasso, to both see the evolution and differences in style, but also the similarities and the throwbacks to earlier works or to later developments. So in a way, this compact display of works helps visitors a little bit to get into, yes, not the mind of Picasso, but if to look over his shoulder as he paints and works along in his career. This is really something that only very few museums or collections can do, because it needs so many works from so many different periods, whereas more or less every major museum has one or two works by Picasso. It is special for us at Museum Berggruen to be able to present you all these different works. Also, with the way the room layout is, one has to move out again after seeing the end of the 1970s, the end of Picasso's career. One has to move back into the Cubist room of around 1910 to be able to get out into the staircase and leave the museum. One closes the circle of Picasso's work symbolically by leaving our museum. Thank you for joining us on this tour. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll be able to visit the museum in Berlin